A frozen water wheel, a life stopped, and the silent surrender of winter. In the harshest winter of 1884, in a small English town, an old miller awoke to find time had stopped. The water wasn't flowing, the wheel wasn't turning, the cold had locked not only the stream, but also the rhythm of a life that had lasted for years. Such silent stories gain meaning only with those who listen carefully. If this narrative draws you in, you might want to stay. On the morning of January the 17th, in the year 1884, long before the sun had risen, in the deepest and coldest hours of the night, in the small town of Millbrook in the north of England, the old miller Thomas Whitmore woke from sleep, as he did every morning quietly. Without haste, he lay beneath his blanket a while longer, letting his body grow accustomed to the cold air of the room. His breath turned to mist. Moonlight broke against the frosted glass of the window and scattered across the ceiling, and at last, rubbing his face with both hands, he slowly sat up and swung his feet down onto the stone floor, feeling that familiar shiver travel all the way up into his bones. The room was small, a bedroom on the upper floor of the mill, with a low ceiling, bare beams, and thick stone walls. A single window, simple furniture. It was a place filled with the deep quiet and solitude that only years could bring. But for Thomas it was home, shelter, a place of peace, his one corner in the world. For 40 years he had slept in this room. For 40 years he had looked out through this same window. For 40 years he had walked this same stone floor. And if you looked closely, you could see it, the way the floorboards near the door had worn smooth and pale, where his feet had passed 10,000 times. When he rose to light the candle, the cold of the flagstones cut through his thick wool socks as though they were paper, seeping into his ankles, his shins, settling deep into the bones of his feet. He began his familiar morning ritual, slowly, unhurried. His hands trembled as he struck the match. The wick caught, and the small flame filled the room with a soft amber light. Shadows swayed on the walls. The furniture found its shape, and the room passed from the darkness of night into the gray half-light of early morning. Dressing took a long time. It always did. His old fingers struggled with the buttons, fumbling, misfitting, starting again. A thick woolen shirt, a vest, a jacket, trousers, all of it layered upon layer, against the cold, against the wind, against the winter. And finally the heavy felt coat, the wool cap, the thick gloves, each put on slowly, deliberately, with thought. There was no hurry in any of it. Coming down the stairs, each step creaked beneath him with its own familiar voice, the sounds of 40 years, worn into the wood by his own footfalls. Thomas held the banister with one hand as he descended, one step at a time, then another. He had nowhere to be. Nothing was waiting. Life moved slowly here. Everything came in its own time. When he reached the ground floor, the main hall of the mill, he stepped into that wide, still space. Here stood the great stone grinding wheels, motionless and silent. For years they had turned. For years they had ground wheat into flour. Now they simply waited, patient and quiet in the half-light of the candle. Above them hung heavy sacks of grain from the ceiling beams. Empty sacks stood in the corners. Old tools hung along the walls. Everything looked like shadows in the dim amber glow. Thomas walked to the stove. The embers from the night before still glowed faintly. He added fresh coal, worked the bellows, and watched the flames rise. Heat began to spread, slowly through the cold air. He set the kettle on top of the stove. Then he walked to the window, wiped the frost from the glass with his palm, and looked out. It was still dark outside, but on the eastern horizon, a faint gray light was beginning to appear. Snow lay across the ground in a thick, unbroken sheet. The trees stood white and bare, and everything was so still, so motionless, so frozen, that the world seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. And then at that moment, glancing toward the edge of the garden, he saw it. The water wheel was frozen. The great wooden wheel, spanning the stream at the back of the mill, was encased entirely in ice. Its spokes were locked. Its paddles were sealed. The water had stopped flowing. The stream itself had frozen, and the wheel, that wheel which turned every day, which creaked every day, which gave life every day, stood perfectly, utterly still. Thomas looked at it for a long time. He said nothing. He simply looked, his eyes fixed on the frozen wheel, his breath fogging the glass, and slowly, very slowly, he let the truth settle into him. There would be no work today. There would be no grinding today. The mill would stay silent today. When the kettle began to hiss, Thomas turned from the window. He made his tea black, no sugar, plain, and sat down at the small table in the corner. He held the warm cup in both hands and drank, slowly, thoughtfully. Each sip carried heat down his throat and into his chest, and he thought about the frozen wheel. For 40 years he had run this mill. For 40 years he had risen each morning, listened to the wheel turn, heard the grinding of the stones, watched the wheat become dust. This was his life, the only work he had ever known, the only thing he had ever done. And now, one morning, all of it had stopped. But Thomas did not panic. He did not rage. He felt no anger. He simply accepted it, because this was winter. This was nature. This was life. Sometimes things stop. Sometimes the world goes quiet. And this quietness, too, must be accepted. When he finished his tea, he stood. He put on his coat, his gloves, his cap. He prepared to go outside. When he opened the door, the cold hit his face like a slap, sharp, merciless, breathtaking. But Thomas was used to it. He stepped out. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and he walked toward the wheel. As he drew closer, he saw the full extent of the freezing. The ice was thick, clear and hard, with small air bubbles trapped inside it like tiny planets. The wooden spokes were imprisoned within it. The paddles had grown heavy with ice, and the stream, that stream which always ran, which always sang, was now a solid, silent surface like a sheet of dark stone. He walked around it slowly, studying it. He reached out and touched the ice. Even through his glove, the cold bit into his fingertips. The ice was so thick that he knew at once melting it would take days, perhaps weeks. Perhaps he would have to wait until spring. He stood there for a while, resting his hands on the wooden frame of the wheel. He felt the familiar texture beneath his palms, wood worn smooth by years of touch, polished by hands that had gripped it 10,000 times, places where fingers had rested over and over until the wood itself had grown bright, and now even this wood was frozen, cold. Then he turned. He walked back to the mill. The snow crunched under his boots. His breath rose in white clouds. The sky was lightening. A pale gray brightness was spreading across the heavens. The sun was not visible, but its light was coming, a cold light, a winter light. He stepped back inside and closed the door behind him, shutting the cold out. He walked to the main floor. The stove was still burning, but the room was still cold. Winter's chills seeped so deep that even a fire could not always reach it. What would he do now? The wheel was not turning. There was no work. No customers would come. No wheat would be ground. But Thomas did not sit down to wait, because in a mill, even on days when nothing moves, there is always something to be done. The work never truly ends. He climbed the stairs to the upper floor, to the grain store. Here rows of sacks were lined against the walls, some full, some empty. Wheat, barley, oats, all of it was here, kept in the dark, cool space, protected from mice, from damp, from rot. Thomas checked each sack, one by one. He opened one, dipped his hand inside, felt the grains between his fingers. dry and firm. They were in good condition. He brought the handful to his nose and breathed in. No smell of mold. Then he moved to the next sack, slowly, patiently, each one checked with care, because this grain was precious. It belonged to his customers. It was entrusted to him. It was his responsibility. In one sack, he found a sign of damp. The edge of the cloth was slightly wet to the touch. He pulled the sack away from the wall. The grain inside would need to be moved to a dry sack, but not now, tomorrow, or perhaps the day after. There was no rush. Then he descended to the main floor. He looked at the grinding stones, wiped the dust from their surfaces, ran his hands across them. These stones, which had turned for years, which had carried tons of weight, they were wearing down slowly. One day they would need to be replaced, but not today. Perhaps next year, perhaps after that. In the corner stood an old wooden bucket that had sprung a leak. Thomas had noticed the crack weeks ago, but had never found the time to mend it. Now he had time. He went to his workbench, laid out his tools, scraps of wood, nails, a hammer. He arranged them carefully, one beside the other, each in its place. He brought the bucket to the bench and examined the crack. It was small, a split in the wood where age and dryness had done their quiet work. A new piece of timber would need to be fitted. Thomas sorted through his scraps, found the right piece, measured it, and set the saw to work. Slowly, evenly, the sawdust curled and fell, filling the air with its warm, familiar smell, the smell of wood, the smell of work. As he sawed, his arms grew tired. It was easier in younger days. Everything demanded less effort then. But Thomas paused, rested, and then continued. Because why hurry? He had nothing else to do today. When the piece was cut, he fitted it into place, aligned it carefully, marked the nail holes, and bored them out one at a time, slowly with attention. Then he drove the nails in, one by one, firmly and evenly. And when it was done, the bucket was whole again. Solid. It might last another few years yet. He stepped back and looked at what he had made. A quiet pride moved through him, small but real. A small job, an honest job, made with his own hands. And that was enough. By midday, his stomach had begun to rumble. He went to the kitchen. There was bread left over from the day before, a little hard now, but still edible. There was cheese. There was an onion. He took these things to the table and sat down and ate, slowly, quietly, alone, watching the world through the window as he chewed. The snow still lay on the ground. A light wind was blowing. The branches of the trees swayed gently. The village sat in the distance, small and still, with thin columns of smoke rising from its chimneys. Life was going on out there, but here in the mill, time seemed to have stopped. When he had finished eating, he drank his tea. Then he checked the stove, added more coal. The heat must keep going. The night would be cold. That afternoon he went back outside, down to the stream, to look at the wheel again. The sun had risen a little higher, but the light was weak. The ice had not melted at all. The air was so cold that the ice would hold all day. It might even grow thicker by evening. He turned and walked around the mill, checking the walls, inspecting the roof, looking for any damage the winter storms might have caused. But everything was in order. Everything was sound. The mill was 100 years old. It had seen many winters before this one. He went out to the hen house. The chickens were huddled inside, puffed up against the cold, pressing close together for warmth. Thomas scattered feed for them, then filled their water dish, but the water had frozen solid overnight. He carried the bucket back inside, set it on the stove, and waited for the ice to melt. When it had, he brought the water back out. The chickens drank, and Thomas watched them for a while. Simple creatures, living simple lives. But they were at peace. As evening drew near, the sky deepened. The grays turned to purples. The cold sharpened further. Thomas went back inside, lit the stove, and made his supper. A thick vegetable soup, plain but hot. He ate it sitting at the table, and the warmth of it spread through his belly and into his chest. After the meal, Thomas sat at the table. He wrapped both hands around his cup and felt the heat seep into his palms, and he thought long and deep about the frozen wheel, about the silent mill, about the quiet day, and about his life. 40 years ago, he had come here as a young man. The old miller had died, and Thomas had taken his place. In those days he was strong. He was restless with ambition. He would work hard, he told himself. He would succeed. He would grow the mill into something bigger. He might even become wealthy. One day, but life had taken a different path. He had married. A woman, a beautiful woman. Her name was Mary. Together they had lived in this mill, in these rooms, working side by side. Happy years, industrious years. But they had no children. The years passed. Hope grew thin, and at last they accepted it, quietly, between themselves. It would be just the three of them. Then Mary fell ill. A slow sickness. It crept through days, through months, through years. Thomas cared for her as best he could. He did everything in his power, but it was not enough. And one winter day, a day as cold as this one, with the same gray sky and the same frozen silence, Mary died, quietly, peacefully, her hand resting in Thomas. After that, Thomas lived alone, in the mill, by himself. The years passed, his hair turned white, his hands began to tremble, his back grew bent, but the wheel kept turning. Every day it turned, and that was enough for him. Now he sat here, an old man, a lonely man, and he looked out at the frozen wheel, and life to him felt like a frozen wheel, stopped, motionless. But perhaps this was natural. Perhaps life was like this. It turns for a while, then it stops. It rests, and then, perhaps it turns again. The stove burned. The heat spread through the room. Outside, the wind blew, and the snow drifted past the window. The night deepened around the mill, and Thomas sat there with his memories, his thoughts, his solitude. The hours passed. He did not know how. Time grew blurred. The clock in the corner ticked on. The fire crackled and shifted, and at last Thomas stood, closed the stove's damper, snuffed out the candles, and made his way to the stairs, climbing them. His legs felt heavy. The steps seemed steeper than they used to, but he climbed. He entered the bedroom, changed into his nightclothes, a thick nightgown, wool socks, and got into bed. The sheets were cold against his skin, but slowly beneath the heavy blanket, warmth began to build. The quilt pressed down on him, firm and steady, comfort. When he laid his head on the pillow, he saw the moonlight through the window breaking again against the frosted glass, scattering its pale light into the dark room. He closed his eyes and thought one last time of the frozen week. He knew with the certainty of a man who has watched the seasons come and go for decades, that spring would come. One day, the ice would melt, the water would flow, the wheel would turn, and the mill would live again. And with that thought, Thomas Whitmore slept deep and peaceful sleep, the sleep of an old man with a tired body and a quiet. The next morning, Thomas woke again in the early dark. The rhythm had not changed. His body knew the hour without being told. When he opened his eyes, the room was still black, still cold. The window was still frosted with ice, but something was different this morning, though he could not yet name it. The darkness felt the same, the cold felt the same, and yet something had shifted somewhere deep inside him. He repeated his ritual, lit the candle, dressed himself layer by layer, slowly, patiently, and descended the stairs. He fed the stove, heated the water, brewed his tea, and walked to the window. Outside, nothing had changed. The wheel was still frozen. The snow still covered the ground, the sky was still gray, and the world was still silent. A deep, unbroken winter silence. Thomas drank his tea, and he knew that today too would pass like yesterday. No work, no grinding, only waiting, only small tasks, only quiet hours. That morning he climbed back up to the grain store. He found the sack he had set aside the day before, the one with the damp edge. He lifted it, carried it across the room, and emptied the grain into a dry sack. Then he hung the old sack near the door to dry out, slowly in the cool air, methodically, unhurried, because what good would hurrying do? Then he came back down to the main floor. He swept the area around the grinding stones. A fine layer of flour dust had settled there. He gathered it with his broom, tipped it into a bucket. Then he mopped the stone floor with a damp cloth. The flagstones grew clean beneath his hands, catching what little light there was, and even this small act of tidying gave Thomas a quiet sense of order, a small thing set right in a world that had gone still. When midday came, he ate a simple meal, bread, jam, tea, and as he sat at the table, he looked out through the window. The sky had cleared a little. Thin shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds and fell across the snow. For a moment, everything glittered. Cold, yes, but beautiful. Silent, yes, but peaceful. That afternoon, Thomas decided to go outside, not just to walk around the mill, but to walk all the way to the village, perhaps to speak with someone, because he had not spoken to another living soul in days. And sometimes, even for a man as quiet as Thomas, the silence could grow heavy. He put on his coat, his cap, his gloves, wound his scarf around his neck. He stepped outside and locked the door behind him. The cold seized his face at once, sharp, biting, stealing his breath, but he walked. The path from the mill to the village followed the stream, winding through the trees and over the low hills. It was about half an hour's walk in good weather. In the snow, it would take longer. Thomas walked slowly. He did not rush. He watched the landscape as he went. The trees draped in white, their branches bent under the weight of snow. The birds were silent. Nothing moved in the sky. Only the wind stirred, faintly, lifting small clouds of snow from the drifts and scattering them like dust. Halfway there, he stopped at an old fence post to catch his breath. He was winded. The walk left him panting. In younger days, he would have run this path. Now, even walking was an effort. But he rested, steadied himself, and walked on. The village was close now, very close. When he arrived, the streets were quiet. People were indoors. Smoke rose from chimneys. Doors were shut against the cold. Only a few figures moved outside, hurrying, heads down, escaping the bite of the air. Thomas walked along the main road. He passed the shop, past the bakery, and walked as far as the church. He stopped before the church door. It was locked, but Thomas only stood and looked at the stone walls, at the old bell tower, at the black clock face frozen at some hour he did not check, and he remembered. This was where he had married Mary. A long time ago, when they were young, when they were happy. Then he turned to go back. But in the village square he came face to face with an old woman, Mrs. Dawson, his neighbor, someone he had known for years. A familiar face. "Good morning, Thomas," she said. Her voice was gentle. She was old too. Her back was bent, and she leaned on a walking stick. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson," said Thomas. He lifted his cap to her. A small, courteous gesture. "How is the mill?" she asked. "I heard the wheel has frozen." "Yes," said Thomas, "completely frozen. It cannot work." "A shame," said the woman. "But spring will come. It will melt." "Yes," said Thomas, "spring will come." A short silence fell between them. They stood there in the cold and the snow, two old people near the end of their days, but still standing, still here. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," she said at last. "The cold is fierce this year." "You too, Mrs. Dawson," said Thomas. "Stay warm." And they parted, each going their own way. Thomas toward the mill, the woman toward her home. And as Thomas walked, turning the short encounter over in his mind, that simple exchange, that quiet kindness, he felt just slightly less alone than he had that morning. By the time Thomas reached the mill, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. The sky had turned first to gold, then to rose, then to a deep violet. The colors shifted and changed before his eyes, and they were striking, beautiful, but the cold had grown sharper still. The air was bitter. He stepped inside and saw at once that the stove was nearly dead. The embers had faded to a dull gray glow. He moved quickly, added coal, worked the bellows. The flames leapt back to life, but the room had grown cold in the meantime. It would take hours to warm again. For supper, he heated the soup left over from the night before. Thick, vegetable, heavy with warmth. He ate it at the table with bread, sitting quietly, watching the darkness gather beyond the window. When night fell, the mill grew quieter still. Outside, there was no sound at all. Even the wind had died. The only sounds in the world were the soft crackling of the stove, the slow ticking of the clock in the corner, and Thomas's own breathing, steady, unhurried, filling the silence. Sitting at the table, Thomas let his mind wander over the shape of his life, the long years of it, the choices he had made, the doors he had opened, and the doors he had let close. He knew there were things to regret, but he also knew there were far more things to accept. The two were not equal, and the balance mattered. Life had not been perfect. It never had been. There had been loss. There had been pain. There had been loneliness. But there had also been peace. There had been honesty. There had been simple, quiet happiness. Small moments that asked for nothing and gave everything. And these had been enough. For Thomas, they had been enough. The frozen wheel. Perhaps it was a misfortune, but it was also a reminder of the turning of things, of rest, of waiting, of acceptance, and of beginning again. Spring would come, it would surely come. The ice would melt, the stream would flow, the wheel would turn, and the mill would breathe again. Perhaps Thomas would see it happen, perhaps he would not, but it did not matter, because life would go on. The mill would go on, the wheel would keep turning, long after Thomas was gone. Whether Thomas was there or not, these thoughts did not frighten him. They were not sad. They were simply true. And Thomas held the truth close, the way one holds a warm cup on a cold night, and found peace in it. As the night deepened, his eyes grew heavy. Tiredness came. Thomas rose, closed the stove's damper, put out the candles, and climbed the stairs. Slowly, with heavy steps, the stairs creaked beneath him, as they always had. In the bedroom he changed, got into bed, and pulled the blanket up. He lay on his back, looking up into the darkness. The ceiling was invisible above him, but he knew every crack and beam by heart. He had stared at the same ceiling for 40 years, and he thought, one last time, of Mary, of the young days, of the happy moments between them, and he smiled, faintly, in the dark. No one saw it, but he felt it, that small, quiet curve at the corner of his mouth, a smile meant for no one but the memory itself. Then he closed his eyes and waited for sleep, and sleep came gently, softly, like snow falling on still water, and Thomas Whitmore slept, deep sleep, peaceful sleep, the sleep of an old man. And the mill stayed quiet, the wheel stayed frozen, the snow held the ground, and the night went on, long, cold, and silent. On the morning of the third day, Thomas woke again in the same way. His body knew the hour without being told. When he opened his eyes, the room was dark, cold. The window still carried its coat of frost, that same familiar morning, but today something was different. He felt it before he understood it. A faint shift in the air, perhaps, or something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with the room at all, but lived somewhere inside his chest. He lay still for a moment, listening, and then he heard it. A sound coming from outside, faint, distant. Something he had not heard in days. Was it a bird? The wind? Or was he imagining it? Conjuring sounds out of the silence the way a man starving for company might conjure voices. He did not lie there long. He rose, struck the match, lit the candle. The flame caught, and the room filled with its soft amber warmth. The same ritual, the same light, the same gentle transformation from dark to dim. He dressed himself layer by layer, each button a small negotiation between stiff fingers and worn cloth, and he descended the stairs, one step at a time, one creak at a time, into the quiet of the mill below, the stove, the coal, the bellows, the kettle, each one in its place, each one performed with the same unhurried care. And then the tea, black and plain, poured into the chipped ceramic cup he had drunk from every morning for longer than he could remember. He carried it to the window. He wiped the frost from the glass with his sleeve, a slow, circular motion, the way one might polish a lens, and looked out. And what he saw made him stop. The cup held halfway to his lips, steam curling past his face. The sky had changed. It was no longer the flat, featureless gray that had hung over Millbrook for days. There were gaps in it now, cracks of blue, pale and tentative, like light pushing through the seams of a heavy curtain. The clouds had begun to break apart, drifting in slow white masses across the morning. And on the horizon, low and bright and almost painful to look at, the sun was rising, real sunlight, golden, sharp, alive, poured across the frozen landscape and struck the snow and the ice and the bare branches of the trees, and everything it touched began to glow. Thomas stood very still. He did not drink. He simply watched, the way one watches something rare, something that asks to be received in silence. Then his eyes moved to the wheel. It was still frozen. The ice still held it, thick and unyielding, but the sunlight was falling directly onto it now. Long slanting rays that caught the surface of the ice and shattered into 1,000 points of light. The wheel glittered. It burned with a cold, brilliant fire, like a jewel set into the gray morning, like something precious that the winter had hidden and the sun had found again. Thomas watched it for a long time. The tea grew cool in his hands. He did not notice. He was lost in the sight of it. This quiet, accidental beauty, this thing that had been there all along, but that he had only now, on this particular morning, in this particular light, been able to see. Perhaps the thaw would begin today, he thought at last, lowering his gaze. Perhaps the sun would be strong enough to reach the ice beneath the wheel, to work its slow chemistry on the frozen water. Perhaps by afternoon, a drop or two might fall, but he did not let the thought carry him too far. Patience. That was the lesson. That was the cure. He had learned it well. He came downstairs slowly, as always, and began his morning in earnest. The routine continued. The stove needed tending. The coal needed checking. The small tasks of the mill needed doing, not because anyone demanded them, not to fill the hours, though they did that too, but because doing them was a way of saying, I am still here, life is still moving, the hands still work, even when the wheel does not. He swept the dust from around the grinding stones. He oiled a hinge on the storage door that had begun to stick. He checked the roof where a tile had loosened in an earlier storm. It was still holding, but he made a mental note. Spring would bring the time to fix it properly. Around midday, when the light through the window had turned from gold to a pale watery white, Thomas put on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him at once. That familiar bite, that sharpness in the air that felt like swallowing glass. But he had come with a purpose. He walked down to the stream, to the wheel and he stood before it and looked closely, carefully, the way a doctor might examine a patient. The sun was higher now. Its rays fell more steeply onto the ice. And there, yes, he saw them. Small bright beads of water on the surface of the ice, catching the light like tiny mirrors. The thaw had begun. Not much, not yet, but it had begun. Something moved in Thomas's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun, a flutter, a quickening. Hope perhaps, small and careful like a bird landing on a branch, testing whether it would hold, but then he steadied himself. He breathed. He set the feeling aside, the way one sets aside a precious thing, not wanting to drop it. Don't rush, he said to himself, very quietly, the words barely more than breath. Nature moves in its own time. You only need to wait. You have always known how to wait. He stood there a while longer, watching the drops. Each one caught the light and held it for a moment before sliding down the face of the ice and falling silently, invisibly back into the frozen stream below. A slow, patient drip. The beginning of something. Then the clouds shifted. A bank of gray moved across the sun, and the light dimmed. The air cooled at once, a sharp, sudden drop in temperature that Thomas felt in his fingertips, in his jaw, in the back of his neck. The dripping slowed, stopped. The thaw retreated, like a tide pulling back from the shore. Thomas watched it happen. He did not frown. He did not sigh. He simply nodded, a small movement, almost imperceptible, and turned back toward the mill. Not today, he said. Perhaps tomorrow. Perhaps the day after. The words came easily now. They had become a kind of prayer, not desperate, not pleading, but patient. A statement of faith in the turning of things. When evening came and he sat down at the table with his supper, the warmth of the stove around him and the dark pressing against the window, he noticed something, a change. Not outside, but inside, in the texture of the silence itself. It was no longer heavy. That was the only way he could have described it, had anyone been there to ask. The silence that had filled the mill since the wheel froze, that thick, suffocating quiet, had thinned. It had become something else, something lighter, calmer, a silence that did not press down on him, that simply existed, the way air exists, the way the room exists, present, unremarkable, neither good nor bad. A silence that had been accepted. He thought about this for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind the way he might turn a stone in his palm, feeling its weight, its texture, trying to understand it. Years ago, when Mary had died, the silence had been a wound. It had lived in every corner of the mill, in the empty chair by the stove, in the cold side of the bed, in the mornings when he reached half asleep for a hand that was no longer there. The silence then was the sound of absence. It was cruel, it was sharp, it cut, but time had done its work. Slowly, the way water wears down stone, not all at once, but over years, over seasons, over countless quiet mornings, Thomas had made his peace with the quiet. He had learned to live alongside it, and now, here in this mill, in this winter, the silence was no longer a wound. It was a home. Perhaps this was what growing old brought, this slow, gradual surrender to the things one cannot change. Perhaps it was the last lesson life had to teach, not to fight the current, but to move with it, not to resist what comes, but to receive it, the way the ground receives the snow, the way the stream receives the ice, quietly, without protest, with a kind of grace. That night, when Thomas climbed the stairs and got into bed, he was at peace. Tired, yes. His body ached in the way that old bodies ache after a day spent moving through cold air, but peaceful, and he slept deeply, dreamlessly, the way a man sleeps when there is nothing left to carry. The fourth day came, then the fifth. The days began to blur together, not unpleasantly, but the way colors blur when you hold a painting too close. Each morning was the same. The dark room, the cold air, the candle flame, the descent into the quiet mill below. Each evening was the same. The stove, the supper, the slow drift toward sleep. And in between, the small tasks, the patient waiting, the quiet hours that filled themselves without asking to be filled. Thomas kept to his routine. Each morning he rose, brewed his tea, and walked to the window to check the wheel. Some mornings the sun was there, pale and tentative, breaking through the clouds in thin shafts that fell across the snow like threads of gold. On those days the ice softened a little, and Thomas would go outside in the afternoon and look closely, searching for signs. Sometimes he found them a bead of water, here a hairline crack in the ice there, small signs, quiet signs, but real. Other mornings the sky stayed gray and closed, and the cold held firm, and the ice grew no thinner, and on some days it seemed to grow thicker still, as though the winter were tightening its grip, refusing to let go. On those days Thomas simply watched and nodded and went about his work. He had learned over these days not to measure his hope by the weather. Hope was not something that depended on the sun. It was something quieter than that, something that lived beneath the surface, like water beneath ice, invisible but present, waiting for its time. He walked to the village again, partway through the week, not because he needed anything desperately, but because the bread had grown stale and his supplies were running low. The walk through the snow was harder than it had been the first time. The drifts had deepened in places, and the path had grown less distinct. But Thomas walked it slowly, stopping when he needed to, resting against fence posts and tree trunks, letting his breath settle before moving on. The landscape around him was stark and beautiful in a way that demanded nothing of him. No response, no reaction. It simply was, and he moved through it like a man moving through a dream. In the village he bought bread from the baker, a round, dark loaf, still slightly warm from the oven. The smell of it filled his coat when he tucked it inside. He exchanged a few words with the shopkeeper about the weather, about the cold, about nothing in particular. Small courteous words. The kind of words that pass between people who know each other well enough not to need large ones. And Thomas carried the bread home in silence, through the snow, and the smell of it was the only warmth he had on the walk back. One evening, it might have been the 5th night, or the 6th. By now, the days had begun to lose their edges. Thomas was sitting in his usual place by the stove. The fire burned steadily, casting its amber light across the small room. He was watching the flames, the way they moved, the way they shifted and curled and broke apart and reformed, never quite the same shape twice, never still for more than a moment. It was hypnotic in its way, a kind of slow, formless dance. And then he heard it, a sound from outside, from the direction of the stream. He did not move at first. He simply listened, his body very still, his head tilted slightly, the way an animal listens when it catches a scent on the wind. The sound was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Once you heard it, water. The sound of water moved not much, not a rush or a roar, a trickle, a whisper, a thin, bright thread of sound cutting through the deep silence of the night, so quiet that Thomas might have missed it entirely if he had not been sitting perfectly still, if the fire had not been burning so softly, if the whole world had not been holding its breath. He rose from his chair, slowly but with a purpose that had not been there moments before. He crossed the room to the window and looked out into the dark. The moon was up, a full bright disk, high and cold, pouring silver light across the snow, and by that light Thomas could see the wheel, and he could see, or thought he could see, water dripping from it, drop by drop, falling from the lower edge of the wheel into the darkness below. Slow, steady, quiet, but there. He stood at the window for a long time, watching. His breath fogged the glass in small rhythmic clouds, one for each breath, appearing and fading, appearing and fading. The drops continued to fall. He counted them in his mind, 1, 2, 3, but lost count, and it did not matter. What mattered was that they were falling. After days of stillness, after days of silence, the ice was releasing its hold, one drop at a time. Something stirred in his chest. A warmth, a brightness, a small flame of something he had almost forgotten the name of. Joy, perhaps, or relief, or simply the quiet satisfaction of a man who has waited patiently for something and has seen at last the first sign that his waiting was not in vain. But he did not let the feeling carry him too far. He steadied himself, breathed in, breathed out, and turned from the window. Not yet, he said softly, to no one but himself. It won't turn yet. The ice is still too thick. But this is how it begins. This is how everything begins, slowly, one drop at a time. He went back to the stove, added a piece of coal, and sat down again. But he did not watch the fire this time. He sat facing the window, looking out at the moonlit wheel, listening very quietly, very patiently, to the sound of water finding its way back into the world. The next morning broke cold and clear. The sky was a deep, clean blue, the kind of blue that only comes after a long stretch of gray, the kind that seems almost too bright, too vivid, as though the world has been washed clean overnight. Thomas dressed quickly, more quickly than usual, though he could not have said exactly why, and went outside. He walked to the wheel, and what he saw there made him stop short, one hand reaching instinctively for the wooden frame, steadying himself against the sight of it. The ice had thinned, noticeably, dramatically. Where before it had been thick and solid and opaque, now it was translucent in places, thin enough that Thomas could see the dark shape of the wood beneath it, like a figure seen through frosted glass. Water was moving along the stream bed, not much, not yet, but a steady bright thread of it, catching the sunlight and turning it to silver as it flowed. The creek was waking up. Thomas stood there and watched it, the water moving, the ice retreating, the slow, inevitable return of life to this place. And something happened that he had not expected. One of the wheel's paddles shifted, just barely. A small rotation, no more than an inch or two. It might have been the current pushing against it. It might have been the weight of the melting ice redistributing itself. He could not tell, but the paddle moved, and when it did, when that first faint, almost imperceptible motion passed through the great wooden structure of the wheel, Thomas felt it in his chest, as though something inside him had shifted too, and he smiled, a wide open smile, the kind that uses the whole face, that creases the skin around the eyes, and lifts the corners of the mouth, and changes the shape of a person entirely. The first real smile in days, perhaps long. The next morning, Thomas woke before the light. But this time, when he opened his eyes, the first thing he was aware of was not the cold, not the darkness, not the silence. It was a sound that filled the mill from the very bottom, rising through the floorboards, through the walls, through the wooden beams of the ceiling above him, a deep, rhythmic, living sound. The wheel was turning. He lay still for a moment, listening to it, the low groan of wood against stone, the rush and splash of water passing beneath the paddles, the steady, ancient heartbeat of the mill itself, a sound he had heard every day for 40 years, a sound so familiar that for most of those years he had stopped hearing it altogether. The way one stops hearing the ticking of a clock in one's own home. But now it was the most beautiful sound in the world. He rose. He dressed, but even the dressing felt different this morning. His fingers found the buttons more easily. His hands did not tremble quite so much. Or perhaps they did, and he simply did not notice. The body, Thomas knew, was a strange instrument capable of performing differently, depending not on what it was asked to do, but on what the mind felt while it did it. He came downstairs into the main hall of the mill. The great grinding stones stood in the center of the room, waiting, patient as they had always been, patient as stone could be. But beneath them, running through the machinery that connected the wheel to the stones, Thomas could feel the vibration. The wheel was turning. The power was there. All that remained was to open the gates and let the grain flow. But first, he went outside. He stepped through the door and into the morning air, and the cold struck him as it always did, sharp and clean, like the first breath after a long sleep. But this morning, the cold felt different. It felt like part of something, not an enemy to be endured, but an element to be moved through, the way a swimmer moves through water, with resistance, yes, but also with purpose, with direction, with life. He walked to the wheel, and there it was, turning, fully steadily, with a rhythm that had become as natural to this place as the flow of the stream itself. The water ran beneath it, clear and fast, freed from its shell of ice. The paddles dipped and rose, carrying the stream's energy up and around and down again in an endless, unhurried circle, and the sound of it, the creak of the wood, the rush of the water, the deep mechanical groan of the whole structure, working as it was meant to work, filled the morning air like music. Thomas stood before it for a long time. He did not move. He simply watched, the way one watches a fire, or the sea, or the slow turning of clouds in a summer sky. There was something almost sacred in it. This wheel had been here before Thomas was born. It would be here after he was gone. It had turned through 100 winters, had survived 100 freezes, and each spring it had woken again, patient, faithful, indifferent to the passage of time. And Thomas, watching it now, felt something he could not quite name, a gratitude perhaps, or a recognition, a sense of being part of something larger than himself, something that did not need him, but that he was glad in his quiet way to have served. He went back inside. He checked the grinding stones, ran his hands across their surfaces, feeling for cracks or wear. He poured oil into the bearings, working slowly and carefully, the way a craftsman tends to his tools. He adjusted the gates, tested the flow. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. The mill was alive again. Then he put on his coat and walked to the village. The walk felt shorter than it had in weeks, or perhaps it was simply that his legs moved more easily, that the weight he had carried through the snow for days had lifted from his shoulders without his noticing. The sun was out, bright and low, and the snow glittered beneath it. Birds were singing, not many, not yet, but a few brave voices calling out from the bare branches of the trees, testing the air, announcing that something had changed. In the village, Thomas found the people he needed to find. He stood in the square, near the baker's shop, and spoke to those who passed. His voice was quiet. It had always been quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. A steadiness, a warmth. "The mill is open," he said. "Bring your wheat. I will grind it." They looked at him, some with surprise, some with relief, some with the simple, practical interest of people who need flour and have been waiting for it. A few nodded. One woman smiled and said, "Thank God for that, Thomas." And Thomas lifted his cap to her in his usual way and walked up, and through the rest of that day they came. They arrived one by one, and then in twos and threes, carrying sacks of wheat on their backs, loading them from carts, setting them down inside the mill with the careful reverence that people reserve for heavy, important things. Thomas received each sack. He opened them, checked the grain, nodded his approval. Then he set them beside the stones and began to work. The sound of the grinding filled the mill, a deep, continuous rumble, like distant thunder, like the earth itself turning. The stones turned, and the wheat passed between them and became flour, white, fine, fragrant, and the flour collected in the sacks below, and the sacks filled one by one, and the mill was alive, was working, was doing the thing it had been made to do. Thomas worked steadily through the afternoon. His hands moved with the ease of long practice, adjusting the flow, checking the flour, making small corrections that required no thought, only the deep unconscious knowledge that comes from doing the same thing for 40 years. And as he worked, he spoke with the people who came and went, short words, kind words, the small exchanges that form the fabric of a community. He knew their names, he knew their faces, he knew which families needed more flour and which needed less, and he served them all, quietly, without fuss, the way he had always served them. By evening the mill was quiet again, not the silence of stillness, but the silence of a day well spent. The last customers had gone home with their sacks of flour. The grinding stones had slowed and stopped, but outside the wheel kept turning. It would turn all night, driven by the stream, asking nothing, giving everything. Thomas sat at his table. His body ached, a deep, satisfying ache, the kind that settles into muscles that have worked hard and honestly. His hands were dusty with flour. His clothes smelled of wheat and wood, and the damp, clean smell of moving water. He was tired, but he was more than tired. He was full of the day, full of work, full of the simple, irreplaceable feeling of having been useful. He looked out through the window at the wheel, still turning in the fading light, and he thought, this is what life is. Not the grand moments, not the great events, but this, the turning of the wheel, the grinding of the grain, the bread that would be made from the flour he had ground today, the families that would eat because of what he had done. Small things, quiet things, but real, but true. How many more winters would he see? The question came to him now, as it had before, but this time it carried no weight, no fear. It was simply a fact, like the color of the sky or the temperature of the air. One winter, perhaps, or 5, or 10. He did not know, and it did not matter, because here, now, tonight, he was alive. He was working. He was part of something, and that alone was enough. That night, when he climbed the stairs for the last time that day and got into bed, Thomas lay still for a while before sleep came. He was grateful in a way that went beyond words, beyond thought, grateful for the wheel, for the mill, for the work, for the people who had come through his door today with their heavy sacks and their quiet thanks, for Mary, who had shared this life with him for so many years, for the long, slow, honest shape of everything he had lived. And when sleep finally came, gently like a hand laid on the shoulder, he dreamed. He saw Mary, not the Mary of the last years, pale and thin in the bed where she had died, but young Mary, the Mary he had married in the village church on a summer afternoon, decades ago, the Mary who smiled easily, who laughed at small things, who stood beside him at the window on winter mornings and leaned her head against his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. She was smiling now, in the dream, and Thomas was happy, truly, simply happy, in the way that only a man who has waited a long time for something can be happy when it finally arrives. And the mill turned through the night, the wheel kept turning, the water kept flowing, and life, simple, beautiful, enduring life, went on. Days passed, then weeks, and with each passing day the winter loosened its grip, a little more, not all at once, not in any dramatic fashion, but slowly, the way a fist slowly opens, finger by finger, until at last the hand lies flat and still. The snow melted, first at the edges along the walls of the mill, along the south-facing slopes of the hills, along the banks of the stream where the sun fell longest, then more broadly, more deeply, the white retreating like a tide going out, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath it, rich and heavy and patient, waiting as it had waited for months to be warmed. green appeared, first in small patches, a shoot here, a blade there, pushing up through the mud with a quiet insistence that seemed almost defiant, as though the earth were making a statement after a long silence. Then more broadly, along the hedgerows in the corners of the garden, on the hillsides where the sun touched first. The green spread slowly, like watercolor on wet paper, filling in the gaps left by the retreating white. The trees budded. Small, tight fists of green and brown appeared along every branch, and over the course of days they swelled and opened, slowly, patiently, the way all growing things open, until the bare skeleton of the winter forest began to clothe itself again in leaves. Thomas watched all of this happen. Each morning he stood at the window with his tea, and each morning the view was a little different from the one before, a little greener, a little warmer, a little more alive. He did not rush towards spring. He did not count the days or measure the progress. He simply watched, the way one watches a child grow, noticing only when one steps back and looks, and realizing that something has changed without being able to say exactly when or how. The mill was open every day now. Thomas rose each morning, drank his tea, and set the stones to work. The customers came, some days more, some days fewer, and he ground their wheat and packed their flour, and sent them on their way with quiet words and a nod. The rhythm of it was familiar and comforting, like the rhythm of breathing, like the rhythm of the wheel itself, steady, unhurried, continuous. But Thomas was not simply working now. Something had shifted in him during those frozen days, something quiet and deep, like a change in the way light falls through a window when the season turns. He was more present, somehow, more attentive to the small things, more willing to pause, to look, to notice what was happening around him, not just the large movements of the world, but the tiny ones, the way the morning light changed color as it moved across the floor, the way the steam rose from the grinding stones when the wheat was fresh, the way a customer's face softened when Thomas remembered something about their life, a child's name, a piece of news, a small kindness offered without being asked. He listened to the birds. This was new, or rather it was old, something he had done in his younger years and then gradually stopped doing, the way one stops noticing the wallpaper in a room one has lived in too long. But now he listened again. In the mornings, before the mill was running, the birds sang, not loudly, not all at once, but in ones and twos, their voices threading through the cold air like bright threads through dark cloth. And Thomas stood at the door or leaned against the windowsill and listened, and the sounds filled him with something he could only call contentment, a quiet, unhurried satisfaction with the way things were. He watched the sunsets. Each evening when the day's work was done and the mill had fallen silent, he would go to the window or sometimes outside if the evening was mild enough and watch the sun go down. The sky changed color as it set, first gold, then rose, then a deep violet that deepened into black at the edges. The clouds caught the light and held it, burning orange and pink and purple in ways that seemed almost impossible, almost too beautiful to be real. And Thomas watched it all, patient, unhurried, grateful, because he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has seen many seasons come and go, who has watched the wheel freeze and thaw and freeze again, year after year, decade after decade, that this would not last. Nothing lasted. The warmth would give way to cold, the green would give way to white. The wheel would turn and then it would stop, and then it would turn again. This was the shape of things. This was the way the world moved, not in a straight line but in a circle, turning and turning, each revolution bringing back what the last one had taken away. And knowing this, truly knowing it, not as an idea, but as a felt truth, as deep and certain as the weight of the millstones or the cold of the winter air, made every moment more precious. Not desperately so, not with the frantic clutching of a man afraid to lose what he has, but gently, quietly. the way one holds a cup of tea on a cold morning, simply grateful for the warmth, simply glad to feel it, simply present in the moment of feeling it. One evening in late spring, the air was mild now, and the last of the snow had vanished from even the highest ground. Thomas went out into the garden after supper. He had not sat in the garden in months. The bench was still there, where it had always been, an old wooden bench, weathered and worn, set against the stone wall of the mill where the evening sun fell longest. He brushed the leaves from it with his hand and sat down. The garden was waking up around him. The ground was soft and dark, and things were growing in it, not yet in full flower, but promising, stirring, pushing up through the soil with a slow green energy that was almost palpable. The apple tree at the far end of the garden was in bud, its branches covered in tight little clusters of pink and white that would in another week or two burst open into blossom. Thomas sat and watched the sun go down. It was a slow sunset that evening. The sky seemed to take its time, as though it too had nowhere to be, nothing to hurry toward. The gold deepened to rose, the rose deepened to violet, and the clouds high above caught the last light and held it burning silently, magnificently, in colors that had no names. The birds were coming home. Thomas watched them, dark shapes against the bright sky, wheeling and dipping and settling into the branches of the trees, tucking themselves in for the night, returning, finding their way back, as they did every evening, to the place where they belonged. And as he watched them, and as the light faded, and as the quiet of the evening settled around him like a blanket, Thomas felt something rise inside him. Not a thought, exactly, but something deeper than thought, a feeling, a knowing, a sense of being in this moment, in this place, exactly where he was meant to be. Life was good. He knew this now, not as an abstraction, not as something he told himself to make the hard parts bearable, but as a simple, observable fact. Life was good. It was difficult, yes. It was painful sometimes. It was lonely, often. But it was good. It was worth the living, and he had lived it honestly, fully, with open hands and a quiet heart. And for that, for all of it, for every part of it, the joy and the grief and the work and the rest, he was grateful, deeply, simply, entirely grateful. The sun set, the sky darkened, the stars came out, one by one at first, then in clusters, then all at once, flooding the black vault of the heavens with their cold, ancient light. Thomas watched them appear, one after another, the way he might watch candles being lit in a distant window. He did not know their names. He did not need to. They were simply there, as they had been there every night of his life, as they would be there every night after he was gone, permanent, indifferent, beautiful. He sat on the bench until the cold began to creep back into the air, the first hint of evening chill, settling around his shoulders like a shawl. Then he rose, slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees and his back, and went inside. He lit the stove. He ate his supper, simple food, plainly prepared, eaten quietly at the table, and he climbed the stairs to bed, and he slept, peacefully, and in his dream the wheel was turning, not slowly, not heavily, but smoothly, effortlessly, as though it had never stopped, as though it would never stop, spinning on in an endless silent circle. And Thomas understood in the way that one understands things in dreams, without words, without logic, simply by feeling that this was what life was. A wheel that turned, a wheel that stopped, a wheel that turned again, and the turning was beautiful, and the stopping was necessary, and the beginning again was the most beautiful thing of all. Summer came at last, arriving not all at once, but gradually, with longer mornings and evenings that refused to end. The sun rose early, flooding the valley with pale gold light, and it lingered in the sky until late, sinking slowly behind the hills. The air grew thick with warmth, heavy with the scent of grass, grain, and running water. For Thomas, Summer meant work, constant, unending work. It was harvest season, and the wheat came in abundance. Farmers arrived from every direction, their carts piled high, their faces browned by sun and wind. The mill was alive from dawn until dusk, the wheel turning steadily, the stones rumbling without pause. There was more work than Thomas could truly manage alone. His arms ached, his back stiffened by evening, and yet he did not rush, not anymore. He worked at his own pace, steady, deliberate, careful. Each sack was lifted with intention. Each adjustment to the stones was made with patience. He paused when he needed to, wiped his brow, drank water, and continued. He savored these days, even in their exhaustion. He knew their truth. Summer never lasted. Winter would come again. It always did, and so he let the hours unfold as they wished, taking what they offered, asking nothing more. When autumn arrived, it did so quietly. The heat softened. The nights grew cool. Leaves along the stream and on the hillsides turned gold, amber, and rust, loosening their grip and drifting down to the ground. The air carried a sharper edge now, cleaner, thinner. Thomas shifted his focus. The pace of the mill slowed as the harvest ended and preparation began. He stocked coal carefully, stacking it dry and high. He stored food, grains, dried vegetables, jars prepared weeks before. He checked the roof, sealed small cracks, reinforced doors and shutters. Every task was done with calm foresight. This was not worry, it was wisdom. He had learned, over decades, what the seasons demanded. Autumn was not a time for regret or longing. It was a time for readiness, and Thomas met it the way he met all things now, quietly, attentively, without complaint. Then one morning, the first snow fell. It was light, barely more than a dusting. The ground showed through in places. The streams still ran freely, but it was enough to signal the turning. Thomas stood at the window and watched as flakes drifted down, slow and unhurried, settling on the world. He felt no fear, no sadness, only recognition. Winter had arrived again, right on time. As the days passed, the cold deepened, the snow thickened, frost crept along the edges of the windows, and one morning, Thomas woke with a knowing that came not from thought, but from somewhere deeper, from the body, from memory. The wheel would freeze again soon, and it did. One morning, just as it had before, the wheel stood still. Ice locked it in place. The water slowed, then stopped. The familiar sound of turning wood faded into silence, and the mill grew quiet once more. Thomas felt no panic, no shock, only acceptance. This too was part of the cycle. Spring would come. The ice would melt. The wheel would turn again, whether he watched it or not. Until then, there was waiting to be done, and work of a different kind. He mended small things, cleaned corners long ignored, sat and thought. Slow, careful thoughts, turning over memories the way grain turns in a sieve. Time passed differently now, stretched and softened, no longer pressing against him. And perhaps this winter, or the next, or the one after that. But one day, one winter, when the wheel froze and the mill fell silent, Thomas would not be there to witness its return. This thought no longer arrived suddenly or sharply. It had settled into him over years like dust settling on an unused shelf. Quiet, inevitable. He was old now, very old. His hands no longer moved with the strength they once had. His steps were slower, his breath shorter. Time, once something endless and distant, now felt measurable, like a sack nearly full, its opening slowly closing. Yet this knowledge did not bring fear. It brought clarity, because when Thomas looked back, he did not see a life wasted. He saw a life lived fully, honestly, without pretense. He had worked when there was work to be done. He had rested when rest was needed. He had loved deeply, even when love had ended in loss. He had endured pain without bitterness and solitude without resentment. There were moments he might have changed, paths he might have taken differently, but those thoughts no longer troubled him. Regret had softened with age, worn smooth by acceptance. What remained was understanding. A life did not need to be grand to be complete. It only needed to be true, and his had been. On a frozen morning, Thomas stood at the window for a long while, watching the stillness outside. The wheel was locked in ice. The stream barely moved beneath its frozen skin. Snow lay unbroken, as though the world itself were holding its breath, and within him something loosened. Peace came not as a sudden feeling, but as a quiet presence, like a companion sitting beside him. It filled the spaces that once held restlessness, questions, and waiting. There was nothing left to solve, nothing left to chase. He turned away and made his tea. The familiar motion steadied him, kettle, cup, steam rising softly. He sat at the table, cradling the cup in both hands, letting its warmth spread slowly into his fingers, his palms, his arm. His thoughts drifted gently. Mary came to him, not as pain, but as memory softened by time. He thought of the mill in all its seasons, loud with work, silent with snow, of winters endured, of springs returned, of how everything without exception moved in circles, and in that understanding he felt no resistance, only gratitude. Through that day, Thomas moved through the mill quietly, without purpose beyond presence itself. He swept where dust had settled. He straightened tools that did not need straightening. He paused often, not from weakness, but from reflection. Memories rose and fell around him. A laugh shared years ago, the weight of a sack on his shoulder, Mary's voice calling his name from another room. None of it overwhelmed him. It passed through gently, like water over stones, leaving no sharp edges behind. As evening came, the light faded early. Shadows stretched across the floor. Thomas ate his supper slowly, savoring each bite, fully aware of the moment he was in. He fed the stove, watched the flames catch, and felt the warmth bloom once more. When he climbed the stairs, his body was tired, deeply tired. But it was not the tiredness of struggle. It was the tiredness of completion. In the bedroom, Thomas changed carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. He lay down and pulled the blanket over himself, the familiar weight settling across his chest. For a while he stared upward into the darkness, knowing every beam and shadow above him by heart. Outside, the stars burned, distant, cold, endless. He watched them until his eyes grew heavy. As sleep came, Mary appeared, not as she had at the end, but as she had been in the beginning, young, strong, smiling. They stood together beside the turning wheel. The mill was alive. The air was warm. The water ran freely. There was no pain in the dream, no loss, only presence, only joy. And when morning came, Thomas Whitmore did not wake. The sleep had grown deeper than waking, the peace larger than breath. He had gone quietly, gently, exactly as he had lived. For a long while, the mill remained exactly as Thomas had left it. The wheel stood frozen. The stream lay silent beneath its skin of ice. Snow gathered in soft drifts against the stone walls, untouched by footprints. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The rooms inside held only stillness. Days passed, then weeks, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the world began to shift. The light changed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The snow softened, then thinned. Water stirred beneath the ice. One morning, a crack appeared along the stream's surface. Then another. Spring returned, as it always had. The ice broke, the water flowed, and the wheel, after its long rest, turned once more. Slowly at first, then steadily. Its old groan filled the air again, as familiar as breath. New hands came to the mill, younger hands, strong hands. They learned its sounds, its rhythms, its patience. Wheat was ground again. Flour dust rose in pale clouds. The mill lived, and though Thomas was no longer there, he had not vanished. He lived in the worn steps on the stairs, in the smooth wood shaped by his touch, in the careful order of tools laid out long ago, in the knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. The mill remembered him, and in that remembering, he endured. And now, this story turns toward you. Take a breath, slow and deep. Let it fill your chest. Then let it go. Release the weight of the day, the noise, the hurry, the endless turning of thoughts. Think of the wheel, how it moves, how it rests, how it waits, and then begins again. Life is like that. There are seasons of effort when everything demands your strength, and there are seasons of stillness when the world asks only that you remain, that you breathe, that you accept. This moment is one of rest. You do not need to solve anything now. You do not need to plan or decide or remember. You only need to be here, held in the quiet. So close your eyes, let your body sink, let your thoughts soften. Sleep is not an ending, it is a pause, a gentle turning inward. And when you wake, tomorrow, or some other morning, the wheel will turn again. For now, rest deeply, rest peacefully. Good night.